Welcome back. I am Mr. Sosatris. It is Monday, and this week I wanted to go through the list of the 100 greatest books ever written in rapid fire and see which ones I have read, what I thought of them, which ones I think weren't maybe worth being on that list, and so on. Now, this is the Easton Press list. Time Magazine does have a list as well, but that version is just since Time Magazine has been a thing. So like the list starts 1923 and onward. So it's more like modernist and contemporary stuff. And it's not kind of all novels kind of ever. And so this list is also a little bit more loosey-goosey with the definition of book. There's some like collections of poetry, there's some plays, and I don't know, I just felt like it was a better list. Now, it's not perfect, and I am going to kind of mention some stuff, but let's just see how this goes, and we'll go from there. So this is going to be a little bit off the cuff. I don't have a script or anything. We're just going to go through the list and see what happens. So first on the list is Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I have that in a collection here. And I can see why this one was included. This one is a ton of fun. It's action adventure, it's sci-fi, it's great. There's one kind of bizarre chapter that like is not great and hasn't aged very well because it plays into this kind of myth of like white slavery is like this, like the greatest injustice ever done to humankind ever. And it's like, maybe not great. But the book itself is a lot of fun. Next up, we have The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This one is a little bit maligned because I feel like people read this too early. It's given to high school students usually, and it's not really something that I think they would be super interested in. But if you read this as an adult, it speaks to you a lot more. The way we ostracize people and the way awful people get away with things, and I don't know, this is speaking to an adult audience, and I feel like the high school readership that it's kind of forced on a lot of times, they haven't lived long enough to kind of understand why this book is so great, but I do like this one. Next up we have Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, I used to own this one. I don't know what happened to it. It must have gotten donated in a move. There was a lot of those. I do like this one. It's a novella. It's pretty short, and a lot of the stuff that I think we think of when we think of Jekyll and Hyde is sort of not really in there. It's kind of more of a mystery, and the gothic supernatural aspect of it doesn't really show up until like right at the end, kind of after everything's happened, but it's still really atmospheric. I love it so much. Next up, we have Henry David Thoreau's Walden. This is a nonfiction book. It's an account of his stay in the country, living off the land, but it's kind of a hoax because like he had dinner with Emerson every day and he went into the town to like see with people. So he wasn't really like completely alone and cut off, but it's still really good, and it ties into the whole like transcendentalist movement in America at that time, and I still think it's worth reading. So it is good, but it is also fun to make fun of. The next book on the list is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. This is a satire. It's a kind of set up as like a voyage to different lands, and there's different kinds of people there and all this stuff. You've probably heard of like the Lilliputians or the Brobdingnagians. I don't know, I can't never pronounce that one. But it was very much a satire on like government and society, and it's fun, it's kind of goofy. I do still like it. I don't know if it's held up super well in terms of just like the pacing. Like it's something you read when you're studying government and commentary and stuff like that, but I don't know how well it works as like just a fun novel. I might need to revisit this one. All right, next up is the big one, and that is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I do actually love this book. It's great. I do eventually want to do a video just about this one and do all my thoughts about it, but I think people's conceptions of it isn't getting at kind of what the book actually is. The book is meant to be a lot more fun than I think people think it is. So this is a good one. I do like it. All right, next on the list is A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. I have not read this one. I don't have it. I don't know anything about it. Ernest Hemingway is a little bleak for me, but I don't know, who knows, someday I might read it. Next up on the list is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. I love this one. This is a kind of Civil War novel, and it also has kind of an apocalyptic zombie kind of feel to it. It really gets at kind of the horror of war, and it doesn't idealize it, and very, very gruesome in parts. It's good. It's really, really good. I love this one. And I do want to read his other book, Maggie. I think that's a novella maybe, but I do want to read that one because I really like the way he writes. Next up on the list is The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. I've read part of it a million years ago. I think I was a little kid, because I love the movie, of course, the Disney movie, and I remember reading the book, and I couldn't get into it. I think I was too young. Also, Kipling hasn't aged super well. There's a lot of colonialist racism stuff baked into it, so I don't know. I might want to read it again just to kind of reevaluate it, but I haven't read it before. Next up on the list is The Odyssey by Homer, and I love this one. I've got multiple translations. Stephen Mitchell's translation is good, but I know he can be a little controversial because he has a tendency to kind of make edits based on kind of what he thinks the history of it is. He takes out things that he thinks were added after the fact. That's more noticeable in his translation of the Iliad, but I do like the way he writes his prose. Of course, there's always the good old prose version of it that's not poetry. And this one's okay. I think this is probably the one we all read in school, and it's fine. But my favorite translation ever is Emily Wilson's. I love it so much. It's good, it's crisp, it's fun, it gets at kind of the culture of the time, it makes the gods come alive, and it really makes the characters feel more interesting. I like the way she writes Telemachus as well. So good. I love this translation. Next up is Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. I have not read this, and I don't really want to read it. It feels kind of preachy, it's very allegorical, and just doesn't seem like it would be my thing. But the next one on the list is definitely my thing. Next up we have A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Really enjoy this one. Joyce can be a little dense, and Ulysses is, of course, like almost impenetrable. I love making fun of that one because it's so ridiculous, but it is good. But this one is great. It's a lot more accessible, and you get this idea of this person trying to figure out like how he fits into the world and what's the correct way to live. And so he like tries out different things, and not all of them work. And I don't know, the character journey in this one is really, really fascinating. Love it. Next up is John Milton's Paradise Lost. This is another one that I love to make fun of. It is good though. I think it takes him forever to get to a point. He was so caught up in like the poetry and the flow of everything that oftentimes he'll have these like digressions that are like 12 lines long, and then by the time you finally get back to the point, you've kind of lost the thread a bit. So you kind of have to read, you have to like unhook your brain a bit when you're reading his stuff. But there is some absolutely gorgeous lines in this one, and it's one of the few like super incredible like epic poems that we ever got in English. So all of the best epic poetry is translated. Everyone else kind of did it, but and there's a couple other artists that tried to do it, but I feel like Paradise Lost is the closest we ever got to like a truly incredible like English epic poem. But yeah, so it is good. It's scary though. All right, next up on the list is The 1001 Nights. This is a collection of stories, sometimes called the Arabian Nights, but that's a late addition to the name of it. I just like this edition because it's pretty. But it's The 1001 Nights, and they're like stories collected from kind of all over the Middle East and South Asia. They come from kind of all over the place, and it's interesting to read these now because this is one of those really important works of like Muslim literature. It was written in like the kind of vernacular Arabic, not the high elevated Arabic that you see in like the Quran, but it was this kind of vernacular Arabic, and it was really important to kind of have that as a source. Now again, this has been translated, and it was often a victim of colonialism because the English translators who kind of took it they would often sanitize it and fix things up a bit. And so you do have to find like a translation that's true to the original works and doesn't try to like anglicize it at all. So that's hard to do, but I do think they are really, really important in the world literature kind of canon. Next up is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I have not read this one, but I have it. I have this little bitty pocket-sized edition, and the text is very small, so I think if I ever read this, I might get like an ebook version of it with like so I can make the text really big. But I love Dickens, and I really look forward to reading this someday. Next on the list is Candide by Voltaire, and it's a satirical work. I haven't read it. It was talked about a lot in college and all that such, and you kind of hear about it on the fringes and things. And I think it's interesting if you're studying like philosophy, but I have not yet read it. I think I need to eventually. I think it might be interesting, but yeah, don't know a whole lot about that one. Next, we have Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex. This is a great one. I have read this. It's hard to find kind of really good translations. I know they're out there, but a lot of times the version you're exposed to in school is not always the best translation. But it's a great play, tragic, horrifying. It's almost become kind of a meme or like a joke in pop culture. But the original one is genuinely really gripping. But it's probably, you have to go into it knowing kind of the conventions, because when you read it, you're going to think like, well, nothing's happening. Everything happens off stage. All the cool stuff happens off stage. But it was more about, like, you really have to see it performed to kind of get it, because it's all in kind of the acting and the catharsis that comes from seeing the characters reacting to tragic events. But it's great. Next up on the list is Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I love this one. It's a favorite of mine. There are aspects of it that have not aged very well, so go into it with, you know, being aware of that. The description of the Roma people is not good, but I think the character arcs in this one are great, and the ending is so horribly tragic, like depressing to the extreme. But it's one of those ones where like you're so impressed at how easily Hugo made you feel so awful at the end. So yeah, you know, would recommend still. Next on the list is The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. I have not read this one. I'm curious to see how it kind of holds up, because it strikes me as something that has probably not aged very well. I know it ties into kind of the noble savage concept a lot, and I've always been kind of hesitant to read it because I don't know how well the indigenous Americans are portrayed in it, but it is a classic, so I might have to read it someday, and then maybe I'll make a video on it. Who knows? Okay, the list continues. We've got Jack London's The Sea Wolf. I have not read this. I own it. I've been meaning to read it for forever. I picked this up at a used shop a million years ago, and I don't know. I've always wanted to read this one. London is really good at kind of portraying the brutality of kind of the natural world and all that fun stuff. So I don't know. I really want to read this one. I've heard it's great. Even if Jack London's personal views are not super great, I know it's always been kind of unsure what he sort of felt, but there was a couple comments he made throughout his life that were kind of like, that's not great. Please don't say things like that. But I do want to read this one eventually, because I like his writing style, and I feel like this would be kind of a fun experience to kind of get inside his brain a little bit, because I heard this one's pretty dark. Next on the list is Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand. I have not read this one. I don't know a whole lot about it, aside from there's one episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation where two characters are performing a scene from the play, and that's kind of my only exposure to that play. But it's kind of become a really well-known sort of pop culture template. There's a lot of shows and stuff who have kind of done this story, where you've got someone who he's in love with someone else, but he's really nervous and anxious and doesn't feel like he is that much of a catch, and so he has someone else kind of coach him and show him how to win his lady love, because he's kind of hopeless. So, but I do want to read that eventually, but I have not read it. Next up is Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This is a Middle English poem or set of poems from like Chaucer. So that would have been the 15th century, 1400s, I think. No, 14th century, 1300s. I think that's what it is. But Chaucer is a ton of fun. Middle English is difficult to read. It's one of those things where if you say it out loud, you can understand it. But when you kind of see it on the page, sometimes a lot of it is kind of obtuse. If you can find like a modern English translation of it, then I would say definitely do that, because there's some really good stuff. They're really raunchy stories, and the frame story is great, and like honestly, it's a lot of fun. But I just remember agonizing through it in college, reading the original Middle English, and Middle English is so cool. But when you're a terrified college student who's stupid and doesn't know anything, it's so difficult, and like it's just difficult to get through. But Canterbury Tales are a ton of fun, and it needs to be like a movie or something. Actually, it is. The movie A Knight's Tale is based off of one of the stories in The Knight's Tale. And Chaucer shows up as a character in the movie. And I love that movie so much. It's so good. So good. But yeah, we need more. We need The Wife of Bath's Tale. That's a fun one. All right, moving on. Next up, we've got the complete works of Robert Browning's poetry by Robert Browning. I have not read anything by Robert Browning. I feel like I should. The Victorian poets are oddly enough kind of a blank spot for me. I'm not super familiar with a lot of their stuff, and I probably need to fix that. Next up, we've got the essential writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson was an American writer. His essays were really influential, really important. I think I've read some of them. They were kind of required reading back in the day. But I don't remember any of them particularly blowing my mind. But again, I was in college and I had no brain at the time, so maybe if I read his stuff now, I'll get more out of it. So, yeah. Next up, we've got The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. I've not read a lot of Henry James. I read The Turn of the Screw, but I have not read this one, and I could not tell you anything about it whatsoever. Next up, we've got Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This one's really influential, really important work. I feel like its necessity as a book has kind of faded away a bit, because people now are much more interested in like the own voices stuff. And so like for its time, it was a really important book. And it's pretty well written. Like when you read the book, a lot of it is just white people in living rooms discussing slavery. So, you know, I at least she didn't try to kind of put herself in the mind of what it was doing to the enslaved peoples at the time. There are some chapters that are told from the point of view of the enslaved characters. And there's a couple stereotypes in there that it isn't great. But I feel like the book is important, but I'm really glad that we've outgrown the book as kind of North Americans, because now we seek out books written by like either enslaved people or the children of enslaved people, or, you know, Black scholars that are kind of analyzing this. I would say if you're wanting to read something like that, I'd suggest Alex Haley's Roots a whole lot more than Uncle Tom's Cabin, because I think Roots is a more effective book, and it's told by someone who kind of understands the subject matter a lot more. So, but that's just me. Next up on the list, we've got Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and I'm interested that this is kind of on this list, because this is a great book, but this is very much like, it's almost YA before YA was a thing. Like, it's an adventure novel. It was aimed at kind of younger male readers, but I mean, the characters are pretty complex. Long John Silver is one of the best characters ever, and it's so iconic. And I'll also say the best movie adaptation of this is Muppet Treasure Island. So if you have not yet seen it, you need to fix that grave error and watch the Muppet version because it's great. And Tim Curry plays Long John Silver, and he's perfect. Next on the list is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. I don't really need to say much about this. Everyone knows that Holmes is incredible. He's amazing. His books are a ton of fun. The novels and short stories, they're engaging. They're a lot of fun. The BBC Sherlock is not an accurate representation. It is an extrapolation. And the character in that is very different from the real character. The best adaptation of this that I've seen is probably the Robert Downey Jr. one and the TV show Elementary, because that version, even though it's set in the modern day, that version gets the Holmes and Watson dynamic so much better, because Holmes is not a psychopath, he's not a sociopath, he's not rude and awful. He's easily distracted and he hyperfixates on things, but he's a polite person and he does what he does oh, it's ripped, that's so sad. This was a used copy, so that's probably why. But it's good. Holmes is great, love it. One of my favorite literary characters ever. So good. Next on the list is the poetry of John Keats. This is another like early romantic English poet, early 1800s. I cannot tell you a whole lot about Keats. I'm sure I've read poems of his, but I need to fix that. Like I said, 19th century poetry is not my strong suit. I'm sorry. Next on the list is On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. This is another really important one, one that I have not read, but it's definitely worth reading. I think a lot of the science has kind of been improved on over the years, but the impact on society that this book has was incredible. This is one of the books that helped to shake things up and lead into sort of the modernist era, kind of late 19th century, early 20th century? No. Yeah, late 19th century, early 20th century. It really shook things up for a lot of people and was very shocking and very influential. And so I think that one's worth reading. Next on the list is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. I read this one a million years ago, and I remember it being kind of goofy and fun, but I don't remember a whole lot about it. I know there's one part where like Sancho Panza gives Don Quixote some kind of remedy, and it makes him throw up because it's like so awful. But it's satirical, and it's one of the most popular books ever written. Like if you look at sort of just how incredibly popular this one was, it was kind of a big deal. And so I think it's still worth reading. But you have to find a kind of a good translation. Or if you speak Spanish, you can read it in the original language, which is probably better because then there's all the rhythm and rhyme and stuff in that kind of prose. But yeah, Don Quixote, it's great. I should probably revisit it because I think I was like 14 when I read it, a million years ago. Next up, we have the poetry of Robert Frost. Now, this one I am a little bit more familiar with. He was kind of late 19th century, early 20th century, and that's kind of my area. And Robert Frost is great. His poetry is so good, imagery, powerful. He's just one of those poets that you just kind of read his stuff and you just go, wow, it's so good. I love Robert Frost. He was just really great. I don't think I've read everything by him. I've read, I think, a few short collections, but definitely worth reading. Love him so much. Next up, we have the collected short stories of Washington Irving. Now, I've only read Sleepy Hollow, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is great, but I have not read any of his other stuff, so I cannot claim that I have read this one. Yeah, he's good. Another one of those like gothic, like 19th century American writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe and stuff. Really good, really fun writer with good characters. Next on the list is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Now, I read this in school, in junior high, a million years ago. This one's great. If you go into it expecting a Charlotte's Web sequel, you will be disappointed because that is not what it is. It is about the Russian Revolution and World War I, but told in a farm. But it's very bleak, kind of creepy, dystopian, very unsettling, and would recommend. All right, next on the list is Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I don't need to say a whole lot about this one. This is gothic, dark romance at its best. Both characters are awful, awful people. Catherine and Heathcliff are the worst, and it is so much fun seeing them crash and burn. I would recommend this pretty heavily. Next up is the one that I've never heard of in my whole life. It's called She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith, and I can't tell you anything about this. Next on the list is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Have not read this one. It seems depressing, and I like certain kinds of depressing. I like tragic and melodramatic depressing. I don't like bleak, like no hope, hopeless depressing. And so I've never read this one, and I don't know if I ever want to. But the next one on the list is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and this one is amazing, and I love it, and everyone knows this story, and I'm going to be really shocking and say that I like the film version with Keira Knightley better than the BBC adaptation, even though the BBC adaptation is like more accurate, and it presents the book very faithfully. I like the extrapolated version that Joe Wright's version does, plus the cinematography in that movie is gorgeous, the music is incredible, and you get the hand flex, which is the best scene ever. So this is the best movie, this is the best book ever, and I love it so much, and I won't take any criticism. Next on the list is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this is another one that's on my TBR. I keep telling myself I'm going to read it next, and then I'm intimidated by it, and then I don't read it. So eventually I will read it, maybe. I do want to read this one eventually. I've heard it's incredible, and I love Russian authors, and so I feel like I'm a bad person for putting it off. So, you know, maybe this is my push to read it. Next up on the list is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I love this book, and ignore the fact that there's people on the cover. I just like this translation. This is an unabridged version, and I'm sad that it has people from the BBC version. I'm sure they're great people, but yeah, whatever. But anyways, this book is incredible, one of my all-time favorites. It's massive, so I recommend going through it in audiobook version, like audiobook form. But it's wonderful. It's so good, and it's really melodramatic and kind of over the top in parts, but it's just an experience. It's one of those things. There are lots of digressions. There's like the Waterloo section that everyone says, why is this in here? This doesn't do anything to the story. But it does, and it's important, and if you read it, you'll find out kind of why. But there's lots of digressions all over the place, and if those bug you, you can read the abridged version, which cuts a lot of those out. However, the unabridged version is very satisfying, and once you get to the end, you can say that you've read it, and then you can cry in my DMs about how much you love it, and we can talk about it, because it's good. So next up, we have The Iliad by Homer. This is the Stephen Mitchell translation again. This one's kind of controversial because he cut out, I think, chapter or book 10, because it was supposedly written later, but like it's an oral poem, and so things are going to be added later. So I don't know. I do still like the way he writes things. This is the prose version again of this one. I hear Emily Wilson is working on or has finished a translation of that, and once she does, it's going to become my whole personality, because I loved her version of the Odyssey, and I want to read her version of the Iliad. But before then, or until then, I do have this version, which I do like, even though it's missing a book. He does include that missing book in the back as like an appendix, so you can still read it, but it's sad that it's not included, but that's okay. The Iliad's great, and I love it. Next on the list is Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. I don't know anything about D.H. Lawrence, except he was a very horny man who just, yeah, that was kind of his whole personality. There was a quote in the movie Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, the one with the whales, where a character quotes D.H. Lawrence's poem, Whales Weep Not. And I was like, oh, it's about whales, that's nice. And so I read the poem, and it's it's a very explicit poem about whales doing things. So yeah, maybe don't read it. But yeah, I don't know. Lady Chowdy's Lover, it's well regarded. I don't know anything about it. So who knows? I don't know if I will ever read that one though. Okay, next up on the list is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. And I've said this in another video, I've read the abridged version of this when I was very young, and I loved it, and I do want to read the full unabridged version because French 19th century authors are my entire jam, and I love them so much. So I have not read the full version of it, but I can say that this is so good, and revenge is good actually, is kind of the plot, and it's great. It's also very kind of Batman-y because he's got this like secret plan. Okay, I'm getting a little unhinged here, but that's okay. Next on the list is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I have not read this one. I don't know anything about it. I feel like I need to read it, but dystopian fiction isn't really my thing. So I don't know, maybe. Next on the list is Aesop's Fables. I had an edition of this when I was a kid, and I read it quite a bit. They're all like little short stories that have a moral at the end. Some of them are great, some of them are bizarre. Good stuff for kids though, because they teach good lessons. And they're weird enough that they can keep kids' attention. So I was a big fan. Don't know if kids nowadays want to still read that kind of stuff. Next up, we have Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. I've read Heart of Darkness, but I have not read Lord Jim, and so I don't know anything about it. And I don't know if this is something that I will read, because I'm not a huge fan of Conrad's writing style. I don't know if it's just me, but it just never, like, connected. Next on the list is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. This is another one I have not read. Benjamin Franklin was a weird guy, and so I think that would be something that would be worth reading, but I don't know anything about it. Next on the list is The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, 2 books by the same author. This one's great, fantastic action, and I love how it's like The Three Musketeers, but it's really D'Artagnan's story, and everyone else is just kind of there. But it's great. It's action, it's intrigue, and it's wonderful. Oh, and there's a cat here, and she likes Dumas, apparently. Next on the list is Aristotle's Poetics. I have read parts of this, but I have not read the whole thing. Another philosophical work that, yeah, I know, that I just don't know a whole lot about. So we're going to move on from there. Next up on the list is Virgil's Aeneid. This is the translation I think a lot of people are most familiar with. I did also get this translation by Shadi Barch, and I do want to read this one because it looks really, really fantastic, and I love kind of new takes on Virgil. But the Aeneid's great, and it's sort of fun to read it after you read like the Iliad and the Odyssey, because like Aeneas is one of the Trojans, and so he hates the Greeks, and so he spends a lot of time ragging on like Odysseus for being like a conniving bastard, and it's pretty great. So there's lots of drama and everything in this one, and it's definitely worth reading. So I'm going to take a break here. I know we've only gone through 50 of the books, but this is going to be a very long video if I do all 101. So that's it for part 1. I will see you in part 2, which is probably going to be in 2 weeks. There's going to be a video in between part 1 and 2, and then we'll see you then. All right, bye.